My name is Marcus, and for 5 years, I believed that marrying into wealth meant I had to shrink myself to fit their expectations. I endured their smirks while I drove my Honda to their country club, their whispered comments about my quaint job in data analytics, and their endless reminders that their daughter deserved better. They called me mediocre to my face, average behind my back, and treated me like charity work at every family gathering. What they didn't know was that while they were busy counting their old money, I was quietly building an empire in tech acquisitions. And when their family's century-old textile business started drowning in debt, guess who showed up with a life preserver and a contract that would change everything forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time I met Victoria's parents, I knew I was walking into a war I hadn't signed up for. It was a crisp October evening in 2019, and she'd been nervous all week, adjusting my tie 3 times before we left my apartment, coaching me on which fork to use for the salad course, reminding me to stand when her mother entered the room. All red flags I should have noticed, but love makes you blind to the obvious warnings. The Ashford estate sat on 47 acres in the most exclusive part of Greenwich, Connecticut, a sprawling Georgian mansion that looked like it had been torn from the pages of Architectural Digest and dropped into reality with the specific purpose of intimidating anyone who didn't belong. The circular driveway was paved with imported Italian stone, and the front entrance featured massive mahogany doors with brass fixtures that probably cost more than my annual salary. I parked my silver Honda Civic between a gleaming Mercedes S-Class and a vintage Jaguar, feeling like I'd accidentally crashed a luxury car show with a rental. Victoria squeezed my hand as we walked up the marble steps, her heels clicking against the stone in a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like a countdown to my social execution. Richard Ashford answered the door himself, which surprised me until I realized it was a power move designed to establish dominance from the very first interaction. He stood 6 feet tall with perfectly styled silver hair, wearing a navy blazer that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that only comes from generational wealth. His handshake was firm but brief, the kind that said he was evaluating my worth in those 3 seconds of contact. "So, you're the data analyst," he said, not a question but a statement loaded with implications I was still too naive to fully understand. His voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to hiding disdain behind politeness. "Marcus Thompson, sir. Thank you for having me," I replied, trying to match his energy without seeming like I was trying too hard. "Thompson," he repeated, as if testing the name for some hidden aristocratic lineage he knew he wouldn't find. "Come in, let's get you a drink." The interior of the house was exactly what you'd expect from people who'd been wealthy long enough to develop genuinely good taste. Original oil paintings lined the hallways, Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and everything from the crystal chandelier to the antique furniture screamed old money with the subtle confidence that comes from never having to prove anything to anyone. Vivian Ashford emerged from what I later learned was called the morning room, dressed in cream-colored silk that probably cost more than my car payment. She was the kind of woman who'd clearly been beautiful in her youth and had spent considerable resources maintaining that beauty well into her 60s. Her smile was warm but calculated, the kind perfected through decades of charity galas and social events where appearance mattered more than authenticity. "Marcus, darling," she said, air-kissing both my cheeks in a gesture that felt more like marking territory than greeting. "Victoria has told us so much about you. A data analyst, how fascinating. What exactly does that entail?" The way she asked the question made it clear she wasn't genuinely interested in the answer, but was instead looking for ammunition to use later. I launched into a simplified explanation of predictive modeling and market analysis, watching her eyes glaze over with polite disinterest while Richard checked his watch twice. "How wonderfully practical," she said when I finished, her tone suggesting that practicality was roughly equivalent to mediocrity in her worldview. "Victoria's father and I have always believed in the importance of practical people. They keep the world running while others focus on more elevated pursuits." Even then, standing in their opulent foyer with a crystal tumbler of scotch that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, I knew I was being categorized. Not as family, not as an equal, but as the practical choice their daughter had made when she'd given up on finding someone more suitable. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have comfortably seated 20 people, though only the four of us were present. The table was set with china that had probably been in the family longer than my family had been in America, and the conversation flowed around topics I had no reference point for. Mutual friends from the yacht club, updates on various charity board positions, gossip from recent trips to their place in the Hamptons. I found myself nodding along to conversations about people I'd never met, places I'd never been, and experiences I couldn't relate to. When they asked about my background, I told them about growing up in Ohio, my father's work as an electrician, my mother's job as a public school teacher. The silence that followed my answer was heavy enough to crush diamonds. Public education, Vivian mused, as if I'd just admitted to being raised by wolves. How admirable! Your parents must be so proud that you've elevated yourself beyond those circumstances. The phrase elevated yourself hit like a backhanded compliment wrapped in poisoned silk. She'd managed to simultaneously praise my achievement and remind everyone at the table that I'd started from what she considered inferior circumstances. It was masterfully insulting while maintaining plausible deniability. Richard leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass with the practiced motion of someone who'd been drinking expensive vintages since before I was born. Data analytics, he said thoughtfully. I imagine that pays reasonably well. Nothing spectacular, of course, but enough to maintain a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. The assumption stung because it was delivered with such casual certainty. He wasn't asking about my income or even really commenting on it. He was simply stating what he believed to be an obvious fact about the limitations of my chosen profession, and by extension, my life prospects. It's been good to me, I said carefully, not wanting to sound defensive, but also not willing to let his assumptions stand completely unchallenged. The market for data-driven insights has grown substantially in recent years. Oh, I'm sure it has, Vivian agreed, with the kind of enthusiasm people reserve for children who've just explained their finger painting. Technology has certainly created opportunities for people with technical skills. Very democratic, really. Anyone can learn to work with computers these days. Victoria shot me an apologetic look across the table, but she didn't contradict her mother's assessment. That silence hurt more than either of her parents' comments. It was my first real glimpse into the dynamic I'd be fighting for the next 5 years. Victoria loved me, but she wasn't willing to defend me against her family's subtle but constant undermining. The evening continued in much the same vein. Every topic of conversation somehow circled back to reminders of my outsider status. When Richard mentioned their family's textile business, Ashford Mills, he spoke about it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for discussing ancient relics or family heirlooms. 5 generations of Ashfords have built that company, he said, gesturing toward a portrait of a stern-looking man in Victorian-era clothing that hung above the fireplace. Started with a single mill in 1897, built it into one of the most respected textile manufacturers on the East Coast. There's something to be said for creating something that lasts beyond your own lifetime. The implication was clear. His family built things that mattered, things that endured, while people like me simply processed other people's data for a paycheck. After dinner, we moved to what they called the library, though it looked more like a museum dedicated to the worship of leather-bound books that had probably never been opened. Richard poured himself a brandy from a crystal decanter and settled into a leather armchair that looked like it had been designed specifically for delivering pronouncements about the inferiority of others. Marcus, he said, his tone suggesting he was about to impart some wisdom I desperately needed to hear. I hope you understand that Victoria is... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Special. She's been raised with certain expectations, certain standards. The man she chooses to spend her life with will need to meet those standards, not just financially, but socially, culturally. I understand, sir, I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was agreeing to. Do you? Vivian asked, leaning forward with the kind of intense focus that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. Because from where we're sitting, it looks like Victoria is going through a very natural phase where young women sometimes choose partners based on emotional attachment rather than practical compatibility. The word phase hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. They weren't just questioning my suitability, they were dismissing the entire relationship as temporary, a mistake their daughter would eventually outgrow once she came to her senses. Victoria and I love each other, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. That's not a phase. Richard smiled, the kind of indulgent smile usually reserved for children who've just insisted they're going to become astronauts when they grow up. Love is wonderful, son, but it's not sufficient. Marriage is about building a life together, maintaining certain standards, raising children who will inherit not just money, but values, traditions, connections. These things matter in ways you might not fully appreciate yet. The conversation continued for another hour, each exchange reinforcing the same basic message. I was tolerated but not accepted, welcomed but not wanted, and certainly not considered worthy of their daughter. By the time we left that evening, I felt like I'd been put through a blender designed specifically to shred self-confidence. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. Victoria stared out the window, occasionally sighing in a way that suggested she was processing her own complicated emotions about the evening. Finally, as we pulled into my parking space, she turned to face me. "They'll come around," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "They just need time to get to know you." "Your mother called our relationship a phase," I pointed out. "Your father basically told me I'm not good enough for you." "They're protective," she said, reaching for my hand. "I'm their only daughter. They want the best for me." "And I'm not the best?" She was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, I heard my answer. Victoria loved me, but even she wasn't entirely convinced I was the right choice. That realization settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold and impossible to ignore. The wedding planning process, which began 6 months later, was an exercise in systematic humiliation disguised as family inclusion. Every decision became an opportunity for Richard and Vivian to remind me of my place in their hierarchy, while maintaining the facade of welcoming me into the family. The venue selection took place at their country club, a sprawling complex of perfectly manicured lawns and tasteful architecture that existed primarily to provide wealthy people with a place to be wealthy among other wealthy people. We sat on the terrace overlooking the golf course, reviewing options that ranged from expensive to astronomical. "The Rosewood Ballroom is lovely," Vivian said, sliding a glossy brochure across the table. "Though perhaps a bit grand for a more intimate celebration." The way she said intimate made it sound like a euphemism for modest budget, which was exactly what she intended. Richard nodded in agreement, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "The garden pavilion might be more appropriate," he suggested. "Perfectly charming and much more reasonable. We want Marcus to feel comfortable, after all." The assumption that I couldn't afford the nicer venue was delivered with such casual certainty that it took me a moment to process the insult. They weren't asking about my preferences or even my budget. They were simply deciding what level of celebration someone like me deserved. "Actually," I said carefully, "I'd be happy to contribute whatever's needed for the venue Victoria prefers." The look that passed between Richard and Vivian was brief but telling. They hadn't expected me to push back, and they certainly hadn't expected me to offer to pay for anything beyond what they considered my modest means. "That's very generous," Marcus said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "But this is traditionally the bride's family's responsibility. We wouldn't want you to overextend yourself." The phrase "overextend yourself" was carefully chosen. It suggested that paying for a nice wedding venue would represent a significant financial strain for someone in my position, regardless of my actual circumstances. It was another way of reinforcing their assumption about my limitations while appearing to be considerate. The guest list negotiations were even more revealing. Victoria and I had submitted a list of about 40 people, friends from college, colleagues, my family from Ohio, people who actually knew and cared about us as a couple. Richard and Vivian's list contained over 200 names, most of whom I'd never heard of. The Weatherbys absolutely must be invited, Vivian explained, running her finger down a typed list that looked like a social register. Richard serves on the hospital board with Charles, and they've been wonderful friends for years. And the Pennywells, of course. Amanda and I chair the Literacy Foundation together. But they don't know Victoria, I pointed out, or me. They know the family, Richard corrected. That's what matters. These are important relationships, Marcus, the kind of connections that can benefit Victoria throughout her life. The implication was clear. Their friends were important, mine were not. Their connections mattered, mine were irrelevant. Even at my own wedding, I was being relegated to the role of grateful recipient rather than equal participant. The cake tasting was held at an upscale bakery that specialized in what they called couture confections. The owner, a thin woman with an accent I couldn't place, treated Richard and Vivian like visiting royalty while barely acknowledging my presence. The 7-layer vanilla bean with lavender buttercream is exquisite, she said, presenting samples on delicate china plates. Very popular with our discerning clientele. The cake was undeniably delicious, but when I mentioned that I liked it, Vivian frowned thoughtfully. Perhaps something less elaborate, she suggested. The 3-layer lemon might be more suitable. Suitable had become code for appropriate for someone of your station, and I was beginning to understand that every decision was being filtered through their assessment of what someone like me deserved. The expensive cake was for people who belonged. The modest cake was for people who were being accommodated. By the time we reached the florist consultation, I'd learned to simply nod and agree with whatever Vivian suggested. The elaborate centerpieces were replaced with charming, smaller arrangements. The premium roses were swapped for lovely carnations. The grand floral arch was scaled down to a sweet, simple backdrop. Each substitution was presented as an aesthetic choice, but I could read the subtext. This wasn't the wedding they would have planned for someone they considered worthy of their daughter. This was the wedding they felt obligated to provide for the man she'd chosen against their better judgment. The final insult came during the rehearsal dinner planning. Richard announced that he'd be hosting it at the country club, in what he called the informal dining room. When I saw the space, I understood immediately why he'd chosen it. Unlike the grand ballroom where member weddings were typically celebrated, this room was clearly designated for lesser occasions. Retirement parties for longtime staff, birthday celebrations for members' children, events that needed to be acknowledged but not celebrated. Perfectly cozy, Vivian declared, surveying the space with the kind of forced enthusiasm usually reserved for complimenting children's artwork. Much more intimate than those stuffy formal affairs. The message was unmistakable. This was the level of celebration they felt I merited. Nice enough to fulfill their social obligations, modest enough to reflect their true opinion of the match their daughter was making. Through all of this, Victoria remained carefully neutral, occasionally offering weak protests that were quickly overruled by her parents' more confident assertions. I watched her transform from the strong, independent woman I'd fallen in love with into someone who deferred to her parents' judgment on everything, from flowers to food to the fundamental question of whether this wedding was cause for genuine celebration or polite accommodation. The pattern extended beyond wedding planning into every aspect of our relationship. Sunday dinners at the Ashford estate became a weekly ritual of subtle reminders about my place in the family hierarchy. The conversations invariably centered on people and places I had no connection to, delivered in a way that highlighted my outsider status without technically excluding me. The Pemberton charity auction was absolutely divine, Vivian would say over the appetizer course, though I suppose it's difficult to appreciate unless you've been attending for years. There's so much history, so many traditions. Speaking of traditions, Richard would add seamlessly, the yacht club regatta is coming up. Third generation of Ashfords competing, actually. There's something special about maintaining those kinds of family legacies. These weren't conversations I could meaningfully participate in, and that was exactly the point. They served as weekly reminders that the Ashfords had a rich history of traditions, connections, and cultural experiences that I would never fully understand or be part of, no matter how long I remained married to their daughter. The most painful moments came when they would discuss Victoria's future in ways that seemed to assume I was temporary. They'd talk about the right neighborhoods for her to eventually settle in, the appropriate schools for her future children, the suitable social circles she should maintain. Never once did these conversations include any reference to my opinions, preferences, or even my continued presence in her life. Victoria has always been drawn to the arts, Vivian would say, as if I weren't sitting right there. She really should get back to her painting. Perhaps once she's settled down properly, she'll have time to pursue more meaningful creative endeavors. The phrase "settled down properly" was loaded with implications about the temporary nature of our current arrangement. It suggested that whatever phase Victoria was going through with me would eventually end, allowing her to return to the path her parents had always envisioned for her. Even the gifts they gave us were designed to reinforce the message about my inadequacy. For Christmas, they gave Victoria a beautiful diamond tennis bracelet that had belonged to her grandmother, presenting it with great ceremony and detailed stories about its history in the family. My gift was a practical leather briefcase, nice enough to avoid seeming deliberately insulting, but clearly chosen to reflect my status as someone who worked for a living rather than someone who inherited meaningful possessions. Every professional man needs a quality briefcase, Richard explained, as if you were doing me a tremendous favor by acknowledging my employment status. Something that makes the right impression in business meetings. The briefcase was actually quite nice and probably expensive, but the choice itself was revealing. Victoria received family heirlooms that connected her to generations of Ashford history. I received practical items that served my temporary role as her middle-class husband. After 18 months of marriage, I developed a detailed understanding of my position in the Ashford family structure. I was tolerated at family gatherings, included in major decisions as a courtesy, and treated with the kind of polite consideration usually reserved for temporary guests who might overstay their welcome if not handled carefully. The breaking point came during what should have been a moment of celebration. I'd just received a significant promotion at my firm, moving from senior analyst to director of strategic insights, with a salary increase that put me firmly in the six-figure range. When I shared the news with Victoria, she was genuinely excited, proud of my achievement, and happy about the financial security. Her parents' reaction was more complicated. Over dinner that Sunday, I mentioned the promotion casually, not wanting to make a big deal of it, but hoping for some acknowledgement of my professional growth. Director of Strategic Insights, Richard repeated thoughtfully. That sounds very impressive. What exactly does a director do in that context? I explained the role's responsibilities, managing a team of analysts, developing long-term market prediction models, consulting with C-level executives on major business decisions. As I talked, I watched Richard's expression shift from polite interest to something that looked almost like concern. "Fascinating," Vivian said when I finished. "It's wonderful how technology companies create these new positions, so creative with titles these days." The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. She had managed to reduce my promotion to a meaningless corporate gesture, the kind of thing that sounded important but didn't really represent genuine advancement in the way her social circle would understand it. Of course, Richard added, the real challenge in any business is building something that lasts. Positions in large corporations can be so fluid. Here today, restructured tomorrow. There's something to be said for owning your own enterprise, controlling your own destiny. The comment was designed to minimize my achievement by suggesting that working for someone else, regardless of my level of responsibility, was inherently less valuable than ownership. It was another way of reinforcing the hierarchy that placed his family's textile business above my corporate career, even though my new salary probably exceeded his annual profits. That night, lying in bed next to Victoria, I found myself staring at the ceiling and thinking about the 5 years I'd spent trying to prove myself worthy of acceptance by people who had already decided I wasn't worth accepting. The promotion should have felt like a triumph, but their reaction had somehow turned it into another reminder of my inadequacy. "They're never going to change," I said quietly to Victoria, who was reading a book beside me. "What do you mean?" she asked, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what I meant. "Your parents, they're never going to see me as anything other than the mistake you made when you married beneath your station." Victoria was quiet for a long time, and I could feel her working through the same realization I'd been avoiding for years. Finally, she set down her book and turned to face me. "They love you," she said, but the words lacked conviction. "No, they don't. They tolerate me because they love you. There's a difference." She couldn't argue with that assessment because we both knew it was true. Richard and Vivian Ashford had spent 5 years making it clear that I would never be family, never be truly welcome, never be anything more than the unfortunate choice their daughter had made when she'd chosen love over social appropriateness. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while they'd been busy treating me like an interpair in their carefully constructed social hierarchy, I'd been building something they couldn't dismiss, minimize, or explain away. But that revelation was still months away, and first, I had to fully understand just how deep their contempt actually ran. The moment I realized the true depths of the Ashfords' disdain came during Victoria's birthday party in March of 2024. It was her 30th, which Vivian had declared worthy of a proper celebration at the country club, complete with a dinner for 40 of their closest friends and family members. I'd spent weeks planning what I thought would be the perfect gift, a custom photography session with one of the city's most respected portrait artists, something Victoria had mentioned wanting for years but had never prioritized. The photographer's work was featured in galleries, and the session cost more than most people's monthly rent, but I wanted to give her something meaningful that showed how much attention I paid to her dreams. When she opened the gift box containing the appointment confirmation and portfolio samples, her face lit up with genuine joy. For a moment, I felt like I'd gotten something right, like I'd managed to give her something her parents' money couldn't easily replicate. "Marcus, this is incredible," she said, hugging me in front of the entire table. "I've wanted to work with someone like this for years." The other guests murmured appropriately appreciative comments, and I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Then Vivian cleared her throat and stood up, champagne glass in hand. "Before we continue with gifts," she announced, "Richard and I have a special surprise for our birthday girl." She gestured toward the entrance of the private dining room where two uniformed men were wheeling in what appeared to be a large painting covered by a cloth. The presentation was clearly choreographed, designed to dwarf whatever other gifts had or would be given. "Victoria, darling," Richard said, joining his wife beside the covered artwork, "this belonged to your great-grandmother Ashford. It's been in storage since we moved to the current house, but we thought it was time for it to come home." They pulled away the cloth with the kind of flourish usually reserved for unveiling historical monuments, revealing a stunning oil portrait of a woman in Victorian dress, painted by what I later learned was a fairly well-known 19th-century artist. The room filled with appreciative gasps and murmurs about family heritage and artistic value. "It's worth approximately $200,000, Vivian announced, as if the monetary value was just an interesting side note rather than the main point. But of course, the sentimental value is priceless. 4 generations of Ashford women have treasured this piece. The timing and presentation were no coincidence. They deliberately waited until after I'd given my gift to present something that cost roughly 4 times my annual salary, something I could never compete with because it represented not just money, but family history, cultural significance, and inherited status. Victoria was genuinely moved by the portrait, and she should have been. It was a beautiful piece with real emotional significance. But I couldn't help noticing how the presentation had been designed to highlight the difference between what I could offer her and what her family could provide. "A photography session and a priceless family heirloom," said Charles Weatherby, one of Richard's business associates. "What wonderful variety in gift-giving approaches." The comment seemed innocent enough, but I caught the subtle implication. My gift was nice, theirs was priceless. My gesture was thoughtful, theirs was historically significant. My offering was something you could purchase, theirs was something you inherited. The pattern continued through the evening. Every conversation seemed designed to reinforce the distinction between people who belonged and people who were accommodated. When discussing vacation plans, they talked about family properties in Martha's Vineyard and inherited timeshares in exclusive resorts. When mentioning business matters, they referenced connections built over generations and relationships that predated my existence. "The Morrison account has been with Ashford Mills for 60 years, Richard explained to a table full of nodding heads. 3 generations of Morrisons working with 3 generations of Ashfords. That's the kind of business relationship you can't replicate overnight." "Exactly," agreed David Pennywell. "In today's world, everyone wants instant everything, but real value comes from building something slowly, carefully, over time." I understood that these comments weren't really about business relationships or vacation planning. They were about reminding me that everything meaningful in their world had been built over generations, inherited rather than earned, developed through connections I would never have access to, regardless of my professional achievements or financial success. Later that evening, as we waited for the valet to bring our car around, I overheard a conversation that crystallized everything I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. Vivian was talking to another woman near the entrance, their voices carrying in the cool night air. "Victoria seems happy," the other woman was saying. "Oh, she is. Victoria is a perfectly nice young man, very stable, very reliable, exactly what she needs right now." "Right now?" "Well, you know how it is. Sometimes our children need to explore different paths before they find their way back to where they belong. Victoria's always been independent, and I think she needed to experience life outside our world to truly appreciate what she was born into." The words hit me like a physical blow. Vivian wasn't talking about me as her son-in-law or even as Victoria's husband. She was discussing me like a phase, a temporary detour that would eventually run its course and allow Victoria to return to her proper social sphere. "And Marcus?" the other woman asked. "How does he fit into the family?" "He doesn't really," Vivian said with a laugh that sounded almost fond. "But he's harmless enough, and he makes Victoria happy for now. Sometimes that's sufficient until something more appropriate comes along." The casual cruelty of her assessment left me speechless. I wasn't a family member. I wasn't even a permanent fixture. I was a placeholder, someone to keep Victoria occupied until she came to her senses and found someone more suitable to her station. I stood there in the darkness, listening to my mother-in-law discuss my marriage like a temporary arrangement that would eventually be corrected, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a kind of cold clarity that cut through years of confusion and self-doubt. They weren't wrong about my origins or my background. I had grown up middle class in Ohio, the son of an electrician and a teacher. I had worked my way through state school and built my career through effort rather than connections. By their standards, I was exactly what they said I was: ordinary, practical, sufficient, but not special. What they didn't know was that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they were underestimated consistently enough to work in complete anonymity. While they'd been busy dismissing my potential, I'd been using every slight, every dismissal, every condescending comment as motivation to build something they couldn't ignore. The drive home was quiet. Victoria seemed tired, probably from the emotional intensity of receiving such a meaningful family gift. I was quiet for different reasons, processing the conversation I'd overheard and finally understanding with complete clarity exactly where I stood in the Ashford family hierarchy. "Thank you for the photography session," Victoria said as we pulled into our driveway. "It really was a perfect gift." "I'm glad you liked it," I replied, and I meant it. Despite everything else that had happened that evening, I was genuinely happy that I'd chosen something that brought her joy. The portrait was incredible too, she continued. I had no idea they'd been saving it for me. Your parents have excellent timing, I said, which was absolutely true, though not in the way she probably interpreted it. That night, I lay awake thinking about Vivian's words and the assumptions they revealed. They saw me as temporary, a phase Victoria was going through before eventually marrying someone more appropriate to her station. The realization should have been devastating, but instead, it was liberating. For 5 years, I'd been trying to prove myself worthy of their acceptance, bending myself into shapes I thought might fit their expectations, working harder and harder to earn respect from people who had no intention of ever giving it. Now I understood that their acceptance was never actually available, regardless of my achievements or efforts. But understanding their game meant I could stop playing by their rules and start playing by mine. And I had been building something they didn't know about, something that would change the entire dynamic between us in ways they couldn't predict or control. The next morning, I made a phone call that had been months in the planning. The acquisition my firm had been quietly negotiating was finally ready to move forward, and I had been authorized to make the formal offer. The target company was struggling financially, bleeding cash, and desperate enough to consider any reasonable proposal. The company was Ashford Mills, the textile manufacturer that had been in Victoria's family for 5 generations. The same business Richard spoke about with such reverence, the legacy he was so proud of, the empire that supposedly demonstrated the superiority of ownership over employment. What the Ashfords didn't know was that their empire was crumbling. Orders had been declining for 3 years, manufacturing costs had increased faster than they could raise prices, and they'd been borrowing against their own assets to maintain the facade of profitability. The financial reports my firm had acquired through completely legal channels painted a picture of a company maybe 6 months away from bankruptcy. They also didn't know that the senior partner at my firm had been looking for opportunities to diversify into manufacturing, or that I'd been specifically assigned to identify acquisition targets in the textile industry, or that I'd spent the better part of a year analyzing their books and developing a comprehensive takeover strategy. Most importantly, they didn't know that the stable, reliable, mediocre son-in-law they'd been tolerating for 5 years was about to become their new boss. The irony was almost too perfect to be believed. While they'd been busy treating me like an inferior who'd somehow tricked their daughter into marriage, I'd been systematically preparing to acquire the very asset they used to justify their sense of superiority. The family business that made them better than me was about to become my family business. I spent that morning reviewing the final acquisition proposal, double-checking every detail, making sure our offer was comprehensive and legally airtight. The price we were prepared to pay was fair, but not generous, reflecting the company's actual financial position rather than the Ashfords' emotional attachment to their legacy. By noon, I was ready to make the call that would change everything. "Mr. Ashford," I said when Richard answered his office phone, "this is Marcus Thompson. I have a business proposition I'd like to discuss with you." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Richard finally spoke, his voice carried the cautious tone of someone who wasn't sure whether he was being pranked or propositioned. "A business proposition? Marcus, I'm not sure I understand. What kind of business would you and I have together?" I could hear the confusion in his voice, mixed with something that might have been amusement. The idea that his mediocre son-in-law could have anything meaningful to offer him professionally was clearly outside his realm of consideration. "I represent Sterling Analytics Group," I said, using my firm's full corporate name rather than the shortened version I typically used in casual conversation. "We're interested in discussing an acquisition opportunity with Ashford Mills." Another pause, longer this time. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head as he tried to process this information. Sterling Analytics Group was a mid-sized but well-respected consulting firm with a growing portfolio of strategic acquisitions. The name would be familiar to someone in his position, even if he'd never connected it to his daughter's husband. "You work for Sterling?" he asked, and I could hear him shuffling papers, probably reaching for something to write on.
The casual dismissiveness was gone from his voice, replaced by the cautious attention he would give to any legitimate business inquiry. "I'm a senior director there," I confirmed. "I've been leading our expansion into manufacturing acquisitions. We've identified Ashford Mills as a potential strategic fit for our portfolio." The phrase strategic fit was corporate speak that Richard would understand, but it was also carefully chosen to avoid revealing how much we actually knew about his company's financial situation. I wanted him to think this was a standard acquisition inquiry rather than a lifeline being thrown to a drowning business. "I see," he said slowly. "And what exactly does Sterling know about our operations?"
Enough to believe there might be mutual benefit in a conversation, I replied diplomatically. Would you be available to meet this week? I'd prefer to discuss the details in person. What followed was a dance of corporate politeness as we scheduled a meeting for Thursday afternoon at his office. Richard's tone had shifted completely from the condescending familiarity he usually used with me to the professional courtesy he would extend to any serious business contact. For the first time in 5 years, he was speaking to me as an equal, though he still had no idea who he was actually talking to. After hanging up, I sat in my office staring out the window at the city skyline, feeling a mixture of anticipation and something that might have been sadness. The plan I'd been developing for months was finally in motion, but executing it would fundamentally change my relationship with Victoria's family in ways I wasn't entirely sure I was prepared for. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. I reviewed our acquisition proposal dozens of times, consulted with our legal team about potential complications, and ran financial projections that confirmed what I already knew. Ashford Mills was hemorrhaging money at an unsustainable rate, and our offer represented their best chance of avoiding complete bankruptcy. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially preparing to save the very people who had spent years treating me like an inadequate charity case. But business was business, and the acquisition made sense regardless of my personal feelings about the current ownership. Thursday afternoon, I drove to the Ashford Mills headquarters in my Honda Civic, the same car that had been the subject of so many subtle comments about my modest lifestyle. The building was impressive in the way that old manufacturing facilities often are. Solid brick construction that spoke to an era when things were built to last, with large windows that had probably provided natural light for generations of workers. The reception area maintained the kind of understated elegance that old money favored. Dark wood paneling, leather furniture that looked expensive without being flashy, and framed photographs showing the company's evolution from a single mill to a multi-facility operation. Everything about the space was designed to convey stability, heritage, and success. Richard emerged from the elevator wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, but his demeanor was different from what I was accustomed to. Instead of the casual superiority he displayed at family gatherings, he carried himself with the focused attention of someone conducting serious business. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand for a firm handshake, "thank you for coming. I have to admit, I'm curious about what Sterling sees in our little family business." The phrase "little family business" was interesting. In social settings, Ashford Mills was always presented as a significant enterprise with deep roots and impressive legacy. In this business context, Richard was positioning it as smaller and more modest, probably as a negotiating tactic to avoid appearing desperate. He led me to a conference room that overlooked the main production floor, where I could see workers operating machinery that looked like it had been state-of-the-art sometime in the 1990s. The equipment alone told a story about the company's financial constraints. Functional but dated, maintained rather than replaced, clearly suffering from years of deferred capital investment. "Coffee?" Richard offered, settling into the chair at the head of the conference table. "I should mention that our CFO, Janet Morrison, will be joining us shortly. Third-generation Morrison, actually. Her grandfather started working with my grandfather in 1962. The family connection detail was typical Richard, establishing historical relationships as a way of demonstrating the company's stability and tradition.
What he probably didn't realize was that it also highlighted one of the company's fundamental problems, an insular management structure that prioritized loyalty over innovation. Janet Morrison arrived a few minutes later, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of tired competence that comes from years of trying to make outdated systems work efficiently. She carried a leather portfolio that looked like it had seen better decades, and her handshake was firm but brief. "Mr. Thompson," she said, taking the seat to Richard's right. "Richard mentioned that Sterling is interested in some kind of partnership arrangement." I noticed that Richard had described our inquiry as a partnership rather than an acquisition, which suggested he was either trying to maintain the illusion that Ashford Mills was in a position to negotiate as equals, or he genuinely hadn't considered that we might be interested in buying the company outright. "Actually," I said, opening my own portfolio and removing a bound presentation folder, "we're interested in exploring a full acquisition. Sterling has been looking for opportunities to expand into textile manufacturing, and Ashford Mills has several attributes that align with our strategic objectives." The word acquisition hung in the air like smoke from an unexpected fire. Richard's expression shifted from polite interest to something approaching alarm, while Janet's face went completely neutral in the way that financial professionals learn to mask their reactions. "A full acquisition," Richard repeated slowly. "You're talking about selling the company." "We're talking about providing an exit strategy that would allow the Ashford family to realize the value they've built while ensuring the company's continued operation under new ownership," I replied, using language that made the proposal sound like an opportunity rather than a necessity. What followed was exactly what I'd expected, a careful dance around the company's actual financial situation. Richard and Janet spent 20 minutes describing Ashford Mills as a thriving enterprise with strong market position and excellent growth potential. They showed me charts depicting steady revenue and talked about expansion plans that would increase capacity and profitability. Everything they told me was technically accurate, but carefully edited to avoid mentioning the declining margins, increasing debt service, and cash flow problems that were slowly strangling the business. They were presenting the company they wanted Ashford Mills to be, rather than the company it actually was. I let them finish their presentation before opening my own materials. The folder I placed on the table contained financial analyses that painted a very different picture of the company's situation. Profit margins that had declined consistently for 3 years, debt-to-equity ratios that were approaching dangerous levels, and cash flow projections that showed insolvency within 6 months if current trends continued. "These are interesting numbers," I said diplomatically, sliding copies of our analysis across the table. Richard picked up the analysis and began reading, his face growing paler with each page. Janet was reading over his shoulder, and I could see her jaw tighten as she recognized the accuracy of our financial assessment. "Where did you get this information?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Public records, industry reports, supplier payment data, customer credit information," I replied, "all completely legal and readily available to anyone conducting proper due diligence." The beauty of the situation was that everything in our analysis was factually correct and obtained through legitimate channels. They couldn't dispute the numbers because the numbers were their numbers, just compiled and analyzed by people who knew what to look for. "This paints a rather dire picture," Richard said finally, setting down the report. "I'm not sure I agree with your interpretation of the data." "The interpretation is relatively straightforward," I replied. "Ashford Mills is a fundamentally sound company with good market position and experienced management, but it's facing short-term liquidity challenges that threatens its long-term viability. Our proposal would address those challenges while preserving the company's operations and employment." The phrase "preserving employment" was important. Whatever Richard's personal feelings about selling the family business, he would have to consider the impact on the workers who had been with the company for years or even decades. It was both a practical concern and a moral obligation that would factor into his decision-making process. Janet leaned forward, her financial training overriding whatever emotional attachment she might have to the company's independence. "What kind of offer are you prepared to make?" I removed another document from my portfolio, this one containing the formal acquisition proposal that our legal team had prepared. The offer was substantial enough to be taken seriously, but structured in a way that reflected the company's actual financial position rather than its historical value. $8.5 million for all assets, including intellectual property, customer relationships, and real estate, I said, sliding the proposal across the table. Plus assumption of existing debt up to $2 million, and guaranteed employment for all current staff for a minimum of 18 months.
The silence that followed was heavy with calculation. $8.5 million was significantly less than what Richard probably thought the company was worth, but it was also probably more cash than he could raise through any other avenue given the company's current situation. "That's considerably below our assessment of the company's value," Richard said eventually, though his protest lacked conviction. "Our assessment reflects current market conditions and the company's immediate financial needs," I replied. "We're prepared to close within 30 days, which would provide immediate relief from the cash flow constraints that are currently limiting your operational flexibility." The 30-day timeline was crucial. Companies facing liquidity crises couldn't afford extended negotiations or lengthy due diligence processes. They needed solutions that could be implemented quickly before their financial situation deteriorated beyond recovery. "We'll need time to consider this," Janet said, which was exactly what I'd expected her to say. "This is obviously a significant decision that requires careful evaluation." "Of course," I agreed. "I should mention that we're also considering other acquisition targets in the textile industry. We're prepared to move forward with Ashford Mills as our preferred option, but we can't hold the offer indefinitely." The veiled threat was delivered politely but clearly. They could take time to consider our proposal, but they shouldn't assume we would wait indefinitely while they explored alternatives that probably didn't exist. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises to be in touch within the week. As I walked back to my car, I felt like I was carrying a secret that would change everything once it was revealed. Richard and Janet thought they were negotiating with a representative from Sterling Analytics Group. They had no idea they were discussing the sale of their family legacy to the son-in-law they'd been treating like an inadequate placeholder for 5 years. That evening, Victoria was waiting for me when I got home, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and an expression that suggested she had something on her mind. "How was your day?" she asked, which was usually a routine question but seemed loaded with additional meaning. "Busy," I replied, loosening my tie and hanging it over the back of a chair. "Dad called," she said, watching my face carefully. "He mentioned that someone from your company wants to buy Ashford Mills." The moment I'd been anticipating had arrived sooner than expected. Richard had obviously gone home and told his family about the acquisition proposal, probably looking for advice or moral support as he processed the idea of selling the business that had defined his family's identity for 5 generations. "Really?" I said, trying to sound mildly interested rather than directly involved. "Did he say anything else about it?" "He seemed upset," Victoria continued. "Not angry exactly, but shaken. He kept talking about how they've never considered selling before, how it would be the end of an era." I poured myself a glass of wine and sat down across from her, trying to appear supportive without revealing my central role in her father's distress. The conversation was surreal, comforting my wife about her father's emotional reaction to a business proposal I had personally delivered. "What do you think he should do?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in her glass thoughtfully. "I don't know," she said finally. "Part of me thinks he should consider it seriously. The company has been struggling lately, even though he tries not to talk about it at home." This was the first indication I'd had that Victoria was aware of her family's financial problems. Richard had clearly been shielding her from the worst of the company's difficulties, but she was observant enough to notice the signs of stress and worry that he couldn't completely hide. "But another part of me thinks selling would break his heart," she continued. "That company is everything to him. It's not just a business, it's his identity, his legacy, his connection to generations of family history." The conflict in her voice was genuine and painful to hear. She understood both the practical arguments for selling and the emotional arguments against it.
And she was struggling with the idea that her father might be forced to choose between financial survival and family tradition. "Sometimes people have to make difficult choices," I said carefully. "The important thing is that he has options." "I suppose," she agreed, though she didn't sound convinced. "I just wish there was a way to save the company without selling it, but I don't think that's realistic anymore." We talked for another hour about family businesses and the challenges of maintaining legacy enterprises in changing economic conditions. Throughout the conversation, I found myself in the strange position of offering objective analysis about a situation I was directly involved in, providing comfort about problems I was positioned to solve. Later that night, lying in bed next to Victoria, I listened to her breathing and thought about the complexity of what I was orchestrating. On one level, the acquisition was purely business, a struggling company that needed capital and management expertise, purchased by a firm that could provide both. On another level, it was personal in ways that went far beyond normal business relationships. I was about to become the owner of the asset that Richard used to justify his sense of superiority over me. The family business that supposedly demonstrated the difference between ownership and employment would soon be owned by the employee they'd been treating as inferior. The legacy that connected 5 generations of Ashfords would become the property of the mediocre son-in-law they'd never truly accepted. But I was also potentially saving that legacy from bankruptcy and dissolution. Without the acquisition, Ashford Mills would likely be liquidated within months, its assets sold piecemeal to pay creditors, its employees laid off, and its century-long history reduced to a footnote in industry publications. The sale to Sterling would preserve the company's operations, protect its workers' jobs, and maintain at least some version of the Ashford family legacy. The moral complexity of the situation kept me awake most of the night. Was I helping them or exploiting them? Was this justice for years of condescension, or was it simply good business that happened to involve people who had treated me poorly? Was I saving the company they loved, or was I taking it away from them? By morning, I'd decided that my motivations were less important than the outcome. Regardless of my personal feelings about Richard and Vivian, the acquisition would benefit everyone involved. Sterling would gain a manufacturing capability we'd been seeking, Ashford Mills would gain the capital and management expertise it needed to survive, and the Ashford family would receive fair compensation for an asset they could no longer afford to maintain. The phone call came on Saturday morning. Richard's voice was formal and carefully controlled, but I could hear the strain underneath his professional demeanor. "Marcus, I'd like to schedule another meeting with your acquisition team," he said. "Monday morning, if possible. We're prepared to discuss your proposal in more detail." "I'll check our availability and get back to you," I replied, maintaining the fiction that I was simply a representative rather than the decision-maker.
"Is there anything specific you'd like us to prepare for the meeting? We'll want to review the employment protection provisions more carefully," he said, "and we'll need to understand the timeline for integration and any operational changes you're planning." The questions he was asking told me everything I needed to know about their decision. They weren't asking whether to sell anymore. They were asking how to sell in a way that protected their employees and preserved as much of the company's culture as possible. "We can definitely address those concerns," I said. "I'll have our legal team prepare detailed documentation about the transition process." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and processing the reality that the plan I'd been developing for months was about to succeed. By the end of the following week, Sterling Analytics Group would own Ashford Mills, and I would be in a position to make decisions about the company that had been held up as proof of my inadequacy for the past 5 years. The meeting on Monday was shorter and more focused than the previous one. Richard and Janet had clearly spent the weekend reviewing our proposal and consulting with their own legal and financial advisors. They came prepared with specific questions about transition timelines, management structure, and operational continuity. "We want to ensure that the company's culture and values are preserved," Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of someone making a decision that went against every instinct he possessed. "Ashford Mills isn't just a business, it's a community. These people have worked together for decades." "We understand that completely," I replied, and I meant it. Despite everything that had happened between us personally, I respected the genuine care Richard felt for his employees. Sterling's approach to acquisitions emphasizes cultural preservation and operational continuity. We're not interested in dismantling what you've built. What followed was a detailed negotiation about specific terms and conditions. The price remained at $8.5 million, but we added provisions for bonus payments tied to performance milestones, extended the employment guarantees to 24 months, and agreed to maintain the Ashford Mills name and branding for at least 3 years. By Wednesday afternoon, we had a signed letter of intent and a timeline for completing due diligence and finalizing the purchase agreement. The sale would close in 3 weeks, at which point Richard Ashford would no longer own the company that had defined his family's identity for 5 generations. The most surreal part of the entire process was maintaining the pretense that I was simply a Sterling representative rather than the person who would ultimately control their family legacy. Richard shook my hand at the end of our final negotiation session, thanking me for my professionalism and expressing appreciation for Sterling's commitment to preserving the company's values. "It's been a pleasure working with you, Marcus," he said, as we stood in the parking lot outside the Ashford Mills headquarters. "I have to admit, when this process started, I wasn't sure what to expect. But you've made this as painless as it could possibly be." The irony was almost overwhelming. For 5 years, Richard had treated me like someone who didn't understand business, someone whose professional achievements were modest and temporary, someone who worked for other people rather than building anything of lasting value. Now he was thanking me for the professionalism and competence I demonstrated while acquiring his family's most prized possession. "It's been educational for me as well," I replied, which was absolutely true in ways he couldn't possibly understand. That evening, I called my boss at Sterling to confirm that all the paperwork was in order and the acquisition was proceeding according to schedule. James Patterson had been the one to approve my recommendation to pursue Ashford Mills, and he was pleased with how smoothly the negotiation had proceeded. "Nice work, Marcus," he said. "Clean deal, fair price, minimal complications. Exactly what we want to see in these acquisitions." "Thank you," I replied. "I think this one will work out well for everyone involved." "Any personal challenges, given the family connection?" he asked. James knew that I was married to Richard's daughter, though he didn't know about the history of tension between us. "Nothing that affected the business side of things," I said diplomatically. Richard conducted himself very professionally throughout the process. "Good to hear. Family businesses can get complicated when emotions are involved. You handled it well." After hanging up, I poured myself a drink and sat on my balcony looking out at the city lights. In 3 weeks, I would own the company that Richard had used as evidence of his superiority over me. The family business that supposedly demonstrated the difference between inheritance and employment would become my asset to manage as I saw fit. But the victory felt more complicated than I'd expected. There was satisfaction in knowing that I'd succeeded in ways Richard had never thought possible, but there was also a strange sadness about the end of something that had mattered deeply to people I cared about, even if they'd never shown me the same consideration. The hardest part was still ahead, revealing to Victoria and her family that their reliable, mediocre son-in-law was the person who had purchased their family legacy. That conversation would change everything between us, and I wasn't entirely sure what would remain once the truth was finally out in the open. The next morning, I woke up early and made a decision that had been forming in the back of my mind for weeks. Before the acquisition became public knowledge, before the family dynamics shifted permanently, I wanted to document everything that had led to this moment. Not for revenge or justification, but for clarity. I opened my laptop and began writing down every significant interaction I'd had with Richard and Vivian over the past 5 years. Every dismissive comment, every assumption about my limitations, every reminder that I didn't belong in their world. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I wanted to remember exactly how we'd arrived at this point. The list was longer than I'd expected, and more painful to compile than I'd anticipated. Reading through years of accumulated slights and dismissals, I realized how much energy I'd spent trying to prove myself worthy of acceptance from people who had never intended to accept me. But I also realized something else.
I'd spent so much time focusing on their opinion of me that I'd lost sight of my own achievements. The acquisition of Ashford Mills wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about building something meaningful with my own skills and effort. When I finished writing, I saved the document and closed the laptop. In 2 weeks, the sale would be final, and I would have to decide what kind of owner I wanted to be. I could use my position to settle old scores, or I could use it to build something better than what had existed before. The choice, for the first time in 5 years, was entirely mine to make. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.